grab yourself a coffee and pull up a seat because today I'm teaching you how to play Wraith and the Giants from Renegade Game Studios. I'm Mark Maya and this is Board Game Coffee.
Vincent, get back here this instant! Oh,
Thank you. Oh, I love you too. I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you. Thank you.
Every 23 years, giants rise from beyond to devour your village. For generations, your family has stood against them. Your grandmother, who's defeated these monsters 4 times, has passed the mantle to you at age 12. Now, armed with her sword and bow, you are the next Wraith, the Undying Warrior. Will you protect the village from catastrophe, or will you be overpowered by the towering might of the giants? Wraith and the Giants is part of Renegade Studios' Solo Hero series. In this game, you take on the role of a warrior facing impossible odds on your mission to slay monstrous giants before they devour your village. Which means we've got no time to waste. Let's get to the setup. For our first game, we'll be using the boards for the Earth Giant and the Young Wraith. The Giant's board should be placed on the left with the Wraith on the right. It's important to note that the components used from this point on will be based on the Giant and Wraith that we are playing with. So, since we're playing as the Young Wraith, we'll be using this pawn with matching illustration and the deck of cards with this back. And for the Earth Giant, we'll be using the deck of cards with this back. The other Wraith and Giant decks, along with the other Wraith pawns, can be placed back in the box, along with these other Giant boards and the boards for the Adult and Elder Wraith. You won't be using them for this game. Place the Wraith pawn at the base of the Giant board, not on the numbered spaces. This whole area is considered the ground, and for all intents and purposes, acts as one big space. Next, shuffle the Wraith deck, place it face down below the Wraith board, and draw an opening hand of 5 cards. Now, shuffle up the Giant's deck, place it face down above the Giant board, and remove the top 5 cards from the game without looking at them. Then, take the next 5 cards from the Giant's deck, and place them face up in a row like so. Collect all the wound tokens and place them somewhere nearby for easy access. Next, we need to create the Giant's health pool. In this area, place a number of wound tokens equal to this number here, plus this smaller number on the Wraith's board. So in this example, we're placing 30 wound tokens plus 5 from the Wraith board, giving us a total of 35 wound tokens. Lastly, place the Rage card next to the Giant board, with the Rage marker placed below the first spot of the Rage track. Now, you might have noticed that we still have these foothold tokens and foothold cards left over. Well, these components are only used when playing the Dangerous Foothold variant, which we won't be covering in this video. But when you're ready to take on the additional challenge, you can read all about it in the rulebook. Okay, now that we're all set up, let's learn how to play. Wraith and the Giants is played over a series of rounds, and each round consists of 3 steps. Step 1 is where you'll play cards from your hand and perform actions. This is the part where you get to climb all over the Giant and poke it with your pointy sticks. Step 2 is when you refresh your hand of cards in preparation for the next round. And step 3 is when the Giant fights back. You'll repeat these steps until either the Giant is defeated or you fail to stop it from reaching the village. Alright, let's break down how each of those steps work, starting with the player action step. At the start of each round, you must play 2 cards. Your first card needs to be played in this first action row, which is indicated on your Wraith board. And your second card must be played here, in the second action row. You must resolve all actions on the first card before moving on to the next. And when I say resolve all actions, I mean all of them, even if they don't benefit you at the time. This reinforces the idea that you can't stand still when fighting these giant creatures. You gotta keep moving, or they're gonna get you. The cards you play next to your Wraith board will remain there for the entirety of the game. On future turns, as you play new cards, layer them on top of each other like this, so that the skill symbol of the previous cards are the only things showing. Okay, so now you know how to play a card, but what does it all mean? Well, I'm going to tell you. When you play a card, immediately resolve the action shown here. These actions typically involve moving around the giant and dealing wounds. Some cards may have more than one action. If they do, you can perform those actions in any order you want, but you must completely resolve one before performing the other. The effectiveness of a particular action will be determined by the number or symbol shown next to it. For example, this Seeking Shot card is both a climb action and a bow attack. The climb action has this number 2 beside it, which means by playing this card, my Wraith can climb up to 2 spaces. But instead of a number, the bow attack shows this eye symbol. When you see a symbol next to an action icon, count the number of matching symbols that came before it. So in this example, we see 2 other eye symbols in the action row where we played our card. That means the value of this bow attack is 2. When calculating the value of your actions, only count the matching symbols that show up in the same row that you played the card into, and never count the symbol next to the action icon. Okay, so now that you know how to resolve an action, let's see what they do. Movement is very important for 2 specific reasons. First, it'll help you avoid giant attacks as they try to swat you off their body, and second, it gets you into position to strike at the giant's weak spots. There are 3 types of movement actions available to you. Climb, which only allows you to move up the giant. Drop, which only allows you to move down. And leap, which lets you move in any direction you want. These indicated areas on the giant are the footholds that you'll use to move around the board. You can only move into a space adjacent to the one you are currently on, as indicated by these dotted lines. And for all intents and purposes, the ground is considered one big foothold that connects to these 2 spaces. When you perform a climb action, you can move up to the total value of the action, which means if I played a climb action with a value of 3, then I could move 1, 2, or 3 spaces up the giant. I don't need to move the entire value, but I must move at least 1 space. The exception to this rule is if my climb value is at 0. In that case, I can leave my Wraith exactly where she is. When climbing, you can only move up the giant. If you're ever in a situation where you've played a climb action and need to move, but your pawn is at the very top of a path with nowhere else to go because there's no more up, then you must drop to the ground. But doing so doesn't cause any injury, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. The drop action allows you to move down a path to a lower foothold. Other than moving in the opposite direction from the climb action, the biggest difference with the drop is that you can move down as many spaces as you want. It doesn't have a specific value associated with it, although you must drop down at least 1 space. Staying where you are is not an option. The exception to this rule would be an area like this giant's elbow. If you play a drop action, but your only option is up, then you'll have to stay exactly where you are. The leap action allows you to move to any adjacent space, whether it's below you or above you. Just like the climb action, you can move up to the total value of your leap. You don't have to move the entire amount, but you do have to move at least 1 space, unless your leap value is 0. The important rule about leap is you can't end your movement on the same space you started on, which means you can't move to this space and then jump back here on the same turn. Alright, so now that you know how to navigate your way across a giant, let's learn how to attack. There are two ways to defeat a giant. Either deal enough wounds to reach its scar limit, as indicated here on the giant's board, or reduce its health pool to 0. But regardless of how you defeat it, both methods will require you to attack the giant's weak spots in order to deal wounds. The available weak spots are shown here on these face-up giant cards. If a card displays a letter, all footholds with that letter are considered an available weak spot. But if it displays a letter and a number, then it's referring to a specific foothold. It's important to note that when you're attacking the giant, you can only attack its weak spots, and the only available weak spots are the ones shown on these face-up cards. If a card goes away, so does the weak spot. Simply put, if you don't see it here, you can't attack it. As you deal wounds to these specific weak spots, you'll remove counters from the giant board and place them on the card that matches the location you wounded. But we'll get more into that later in the video. For now, let's look at what kind of attacks your character can perform. The sword attack allows you to wound the weak spot that your Wraith is currently on. The amount of damage you deal is based on the value of your sword attack, which is currently at 3. When you deal damage to a weak spot, remove that many wounds from the giant's health pool and apply it to the giant card for that specific weak spot. The bow attack works similar to the sword attack, except that it can only be used to attack weak spots that are adjacent to your current location, not the foothold your Wraith is currently on. And it's important to note that although your bow attack might be within range of multiple weak spots, you can only attack one weak spot at a time. There is a minor exception to this rule, which we'll cover in just a few minutes. Just like the other attacks, the amount of damage dealt by the fireworks is equal to the current value of the card. The difference is the damage you deal can be spread out amongst any weak spots that you're on or adjacent to. So for this example, let's say that each of these footholds in my range are currently indicated as weak spots, and that my firework attack is dealing a total of 2 damage. This means I can deal 2 damage to each of these weak spots. Take that, giant. Now remember, when placing wounds, you'll place them on the card associated with the weak spot you're attacking, not the board. I did that just for the example. Earlier in the video, I said that there was an exception about attacking multiple weak spots. This exception mostly comes into play when discussing sword and bow attacks, which only attack one weak spot at a time. Let me show you. As we covered earlier, if you see a card like this that indicates a letter as a weak spot, it means that all footholds with that letter can be attacked. But if that letter is combined with a number, it means that only that specific foothold can be attacked. Now, if both these cards appear in the giant's row at the same time, it would mean that this space here applies to both these cards. So if I deal 3 damage to this single space, I can spread that damage between both cards that are associated to that one foothold. This is the only way to wound multiple cards with a sword and bow attack. If you've placed enough wounds on a weak spot to reach its wound limit, remove the wound tokens and flip the card over to its scarred side. The wound tokens you removed will be placed in the general supply, not the giant's health pool. Once the number of scars meets or exceeds this scar limit that appears on the giant's board, the giant has been defeated and the game ends immediately. If you end up dealing more damage to a weak spot than is necessary, just deal the minimum amount of wounds required to flip over the card. Any excess wounds will remain in the giant's health pool. Throughout the game, your Wraith will take on damage from giant attacks. How that happens we'll cover later in the video. But I'd like to take some time now to show you how to heal from those wounds. Instead of placing a card face up to perform an action, you can choose to place your action card face down instead. When you do this, immediately heal your Wraith by 1, and draw 1 card from the top of your Wraith deck. The face down card shows that an action has been taken this round, but will not contribute symbols to further actions. And just to be clear, when you place a card face down, you do not perform the actions on that card. Since you have to play 2 cards every round, you can choose to take the heal action to avoid performing the actions on the cards you have. And you can do this even if you don't need to heal. On the bottom of your Young Wraith board, you'll see these 3 actions labeled as Fearless actions. These actions don't require a card to perform. You can either drop down 1 foothold, perform a sword attack for 1 wound, or climb up 1 space. Fearless actions can be performed before or after you play an action card, and you can perform as many as you want. But they will require you to inflict 1 damage to yourself for every fearless action you perform. And it's important to note that if you reach your health limit as indicated here, you lose, even if you defeated the giant in the process. Once you've played and resolved both cards you laid down this round, and completed any fearless actions you might have performed, it's time to refresh your hand of cards in preparation for the next round. First thing you're going to do is discard any cards you don't want face up into your Wraith's discard pile. Keeping in mind, you don't have to discard any cards if you don't want to. You can just hold on to the ones you have. But whether you discard or don't, the next thing you need to do is draw back up to 5 cards. If you don't have enough cards in your deck to do this, draw as many cards as you can, shuffle up your discard pile, place it face down to make a new deck, and continue drawing cards from there until you have 5 cards in hand. Now, it is possible that you get into a situation where you have more than 5 cards in hand. If that's the case, you don't have to discard any. I mean, you can if you want to, but as long as you're holding 5 or more cards, you don't get to draw any. One last thing. If during this refresh step, you're not able to fill your hand back up to 5 cards because you don't have 5 cards remaining in your hand, deck, or discard piles combined, then you lose. Your Wraith is exhausted and cannot defeat the giant. Alright, now that you've had your chance to poke the giant, it's time for the giant to poke back. The first thing the giant is going to do on its turn is attempt to attack you. And they do this by activating the leftmost card in their row of cards. The bottom of that card will indicate where the giant's attack will take place, and what kind of damage they deal if their attack is successful. The location of the attack will typically target part of the giant's body, but may include the ground. For example, the leftmost card in the giant's row says, "If in B, then do this." This means if your Wraith is on any of the B spaces, you will suffer the consequences of this attack. Now, if you're not on any of the B spaces, then you avoid the attack altogether. So when you're climbing your way around the giant's body on your turn, it's a good idea to keep an eye on what attacks are coming in order to best avoid them. The giant typically deals 2 types of damage when it lands an attack. When you see this icon, remove the top card of your Wraith deck from the game without looking at it. If you can't do this because your deck is currently depleted, then shuffle your discard pile to make a new deck and take a top card from there. If you still don't have enough cards to do this, then you got 1 turn left before you become exhausted and lose the game. When you see this icon, take 1 wound token from the general supply and place it on your Wraith board. If the amount of wounds on your Wraith board is equal to or greater than your wound limit, you lose. And just so we're clear, the amount of cards you discard or wounds you take is equal to the number of icons that appear on the giant's card. Alright, you know how I just said the first thing the giant does is attack with the leftmost card in its row? Well, if there's even one wound on that card, the giant will not perform that attack. And if the leftmost card is a scar, it also won't perform that attack. The next thing that happens on the giant's turn is a cycling of cards. Now, regardless if the attack was successful or the card had a wound on it or not, remove the leftmost card from the giant's row, place it in the giant's discard pile, and return any wounds on it to the general supply. Then slide the cards over to the left to fill in the gap. If the card you removed was a scar, place it above the giant's row instead of placing it in its discard pile. This will make it easier to track how many scars the giant has incurred. Once that's done, take the top card of the giant's deck and place it at the end of the row face up. If you can't do this because there are no more cards in the giant's deck, then the giant has reached the village and you lose. But for the sake of this video, let's assume that hasn't happened and continue with our example. After you add the card to the end of the row, you need to check for additional attacks. If you notice, each of the giant cards has a symbol here. Compare the symbol on the card that you just placed to the other cards in the giant's row. Any card with the same symbol will perform the attack listed on that card. If the symbol appears on multiple cards, then resolve the attacks one at a time from left to right. But don't resolve the attack on the card you just placed. Cards that are triggered to attack in this way are not removed from the row. And remember, cards that have at least one wound token on them, or that are turned over due to scarring, do not wound your Wraith, or apply their effects, unless the text on that card states otherwise. Now, if the symbol doesn't match any of the cards in the row, you don't have to perform any additional attacks. Giant cards can trigger special attacks that either inflict wounds or force the Wraith to switch footholds. When a When Revealed card is drawn for the giant row, except during the setup, its effect occurs immediately, and only once, and what the effect does is written on the card itself. On the other hand, cards with the abilities that read Always Active will continue to affect both the giant and our Wraith until they either become scars or get discarded. And the effects of these cards will occur regardless of any wounds they may have. Sometimes, if you're lucky, a giant's attack might miss, if it's wounded, scarred, or your Wraith is out of range. When that happens, move the rage marker up one space to indicate the giant's fury increasing. The next time the giant successfully lands an attack, in addition to the results listed on the card, apply all the rage effects depicted next to and below the rage marker. So in this example, if the giant successfully attacked with this card, then in addition to losing a card and taking 2 wounds, I would take an additional wound and lose another card. Once you've applied the additional rage effects, reset the rage track marker to its starting position here. If you notice at the top of the rage track, there's this stunned effect. Whenever your Wraith is stunned, it means that the first card you play on your turn will be ignored. You still play it face up, and its symbols will still contribute to future attacks, but you do not perform any actions listed on that card. Once you've taken your actions, refreshed your hand of cards, and the giant performs their actions, you simply move on to the next round and repeat those steps. You'll continue to do this until you've triggered one of the end conditions, which we'll go over now. There are several ways to end the game. If you empty the giant's health pool, the game is over and you win. You also win if the number of scars you've dealt to the giant is equal to their scar limit. Now, all that's great, but there's more ways to lose than win. If the giant can't add a new card to their row of cards because their deck is empty, this means that they've reached the village and you lose. When it comes time to refresh your hand back up to 5 cards, but you can't because you don't have enough cards to do so, your Wraith is exhausted and can no longer fight, which means you lose. And lastly, if you're dealt enough wounds that equal or exceed your wound limit, well, let's just say it's not good and you lose. After you've defeated the Earth Giant, the Wraith will fight against the next giant that challenges the village. The order that the giants appear is listed here on this giant order reference card. When you take on the next giant, set up the game as described in the setup section of this video, with the next giant's components used in place of the Earth Giant's components. As you progress through the game, you'll play against all the giants as the young Wraith before facing them again as the adult Wraith and then as the elder Wraith. When you do move on to the adult and elder Wraith, there are some additional rules you'll have to apply. The adult Wraith board introduces special skills that you activate by dealing wounds to the giant, and the elder Wraith, as well as having special skills, adds spells to your arsenal of abilities, which can be activated if your pawn is standing on the indicated foothold. We won't be covering those rules in this video, but you can find them in the back of the rulebook when you're ready. In addition, there's also different modes of play, such as Gauntlet Mode and Dangerous Footholds, that offer another layer of challenge to your experience. But I'll let you discover those for yourself. Also, as you play through the game, feel free to explore the storybook and follow along with the story of the Wraith as she defends her village from these enormous giants. And that's it. I hope this video helps, and I hope you enjoy playing Wraith and the Giants. See you next week.
Thanks for joining us. If you like this video and you want to see more, subscribe to our channel. It's the best way to keep up to date with everything we do here at Board Game Coffee. But if you want to see more right now, we got plenty of videos to choose from. And if that's not enough, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm Mark Maya, and this is Board Game Coffee. And remember, have fun, keep gaming, be social. See you next week.